the honor of our shul, the incoming president of Gratz College has been a member of our shul for a period of time. Rabbi Dr Zev Eleff is finishing his tenure at the Hebrew Theological College, Yeshiva, and he's going to be moving to Philadelphia in about a month. But during his tenure, our yeshiva has undergone fascinating and positive transformations, much of it to the credit of Rabbi Eleff and his team at the yeshiva. And I truly appreciate the fact that when I reached out to him with his last month here in Chicago, and I'm sure many other meetings that he has, that he agreed to give this last year as just a professor as opposed to a president. And Dr. Eleff, Rabbi Dr. Eleff, we thank you very much, and we look forward to being able to have sharing for amazing smachot, to continue to learn from you, perhaps remotely, maybe once in a while back in person again.
Thank you, Rabbi Matanki. The title president is, for the most part, lost on me. But as a scholar of American history, you lose a certain level of reverence, perhaps. Maybe that's the case. What I do think that president does allow me is that Jack, who grew up in this role, in a very real sense, is now the vice president of video gaming technology at Gratz College. So I'm looking for great things from him. What I want to discuss with you is something from something that fits very well into Tisha B'Av, but also into something I've been thinking about quite a lot, really over the pandemic, which is meaning making. How do we make meaning out of our lives? How do we identify our spaces, new and old? What does a Zoom shear look like differently than in person? What is a kiddush outdoor versus indoor? And not that meaning making is a new concept altogether, certainly not. But for me, the greatest lesson of what just transpired, mind-boggling, truly over the last year and a half, 2 years, is our capacity to make meaning out of new spaces and to reinvigorate our old spaces with both traditional and with new meaning. And when I thought about what to speak about, and this is all sort of brand new in my mind, isn't Tisha B'Av, I asked myself, and I really ask all of us here, really not spatially but temporally, in terms of time, isn't it a wonderful, complex moment in our calendar in which we have been able to make different types of meaning? We've also been able to drain meaning, as we've seen quite sadly, at a certain period of time. And so what I want to review are some interesting sources, but ones that are negotiated by, I think, important themes in American Jewish history, which are, number one, Zionism and tragedy, the Holocaust, the Shoah in particular. But what I also want to highlight is the capacity of young people to augur change and to help make meaning in our lives. And so my secret hope, it's not so secret, is that some of these texts will reverberate, they'll resonate with some of our experiences, however old we are, young at heart, it doesn't matter to me. How we've made meaning out of Tisha B'Av in our lives and how that has changed and how that has stayed consistent, I hope will bear out in some of these texts. In 1825, a young person in his 30s, Isaac Harvey, not a well-literate Jew. We actually have the contents of his library. He had a Bible, he had a Tanakh, he also had the New Testament for that matter. A not heavily engaged Jew, a playwright, a person of repute in Southern American culture. He and a group of, again, about 40 young people said, we've had enough. We've had enough in Charleston, which at the time was the largest Jewish community in the United States. We've had enough of this Bet Elohim business, this Beth Elohim, the concept of the synagogue. Still around in Charleston, South Carolina. We'd like to stop offering Misha Berachs in Portuguese, This was a Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, as were so many during the colonial period in the early republic. We'd like to have more of our services in English, not just in Hebrew. And that's our request. The older folks at Beth Elohim probably said absolutely not, which compelled Harvey and his cohort of young people to establish the Reformed Society of Israelites, the very first Reformed congregation in the United States in 1825. And in November of that year, he offered an anniversary of the very first, actually the second, breakaway synagogue, long history of breakaway synagogues in America. This was the second in our history. And he delivered a very important discourse, one that he had mailed copies to no less than Thomas Jefferson, than John C. Calhoun, and other dignitaries in American political life. So let's read source one. You'll see why I'm raising it here this morning. The great cause of improvement in government, very Germanic to have certain words capitalized, in religion, in morals, in literature, in the great cause of mankind, bigotry and despotism may rear their miscreant fronts to thwart your way, but the consuming beams of truth must drive them back to their original darkness. In this happy land, offers Harvey, however, you have no such obstacles to oppose. Equally of laws and of freedom of conscience, leave you a wide and cheerful field to act upon. And many people seized upon this concept of this happy land where you have the freedom and liberty to be both Jew and American at this pivotal time. Remember, the revolution was not even 50 years before this. And so, when Harvey left Charleston, unfortunately his wife passed away and moved his family to New York, still the spirit, that democratic spirit of egalitarianism, it continued on in Charleston for many years. So when these young people, it was a failed experiment after Harvey departed the city, when they moved back into the congregation and they affect change from within, there was a fire, unfortunately, in the late 1830s, and they rebuilt their congregation, and Gustavus Poznański, its rabbinic leader, he announces, this synagogue is our Jerusalem, is our temple, source 2. This city, our Jerusalem. This happy land, not a political statement, is what people called it, our palace. And our fathers defended with their lives that temple, that city, and that land. So will our sons defend this temple, this city, and this land, until the last drop of our blood shall be shed on the shrine of our religion and our country. And so you see, Poznański and the Charleston Jewish community, which is to this day known as the cradle of Reformed Judaism, are seizing upon that refrain, this happy land. In this happy land, we can make Judaism in America one. Some people took issue, particularly the Orthodox champions in that city. A few years later, Rabbi Rosenfeld in source 3, thou knowest, I don't know if he delivered it, the discourse this way, or he wrote it in Shakespearean tones. We are bereft of our country, and we must sing praises in a strange land. We have now no Jerusalem, so it's in the air. People know exactly what he's referring to. No temple, no high priest, and no burnt offering for any worship. But, O Lord, though despisest not a repentant heart, therefore wilt thou hear our prayers, which we will offer up to thee within the walls of the house to be erected on this foundation. And it wasn't just in Charleston. Coincidence that I'm going to quote a number of sources from Philadelphia. Did make an effort to quote Chicago quite often in this social hall. Rebecca Gratz, the great Jewish philanthropist, very important family in American Jewish history. I have not seen the paper, referring to the Courier in source 2. You sent containing an account of the Charleston congregation, but I've heard some passages quoted that are certainly unorthodox. This, popular term now, unorthodox. This is our temple. This is our city. This is our Palestine. Is it possible that a Jew, referring to Gustavus Poznanski, can write or speak so? Then where is the truth of prophecy? Where the fulfillment of promises? What is the hope of Israel? Of what does the scattered people bear witness? Alas, we may hang our harps on the willow and weep for the spiritual destruction of Jerusalem when her own children are content to sing the songs of Zion in a strange land and deny the words of God, so often repeated by the prophets. So these were fighting words. The Charleston Jewish community had sought to abrogate a sense of, I would call it Zionism. That's a political term that only begins in the late 19th century. But to adopt America as their home. In fact, Poznanski got into a real fight with, actually, the fellow in source 5, when he replaced the 13 principles of faith of the Rambam, of Maimonides. He deleted the last 2. So restoration of the dead and return to Zion. So this very much was a part of the religious politics of American Judaism in the 19th century, and obviously has great bearing on the import of Tisha B'Av, as we'll see in a moment. To complete the reception history of this happy land, look at Morris Raphael, a rabbi of B'nai Shurin, which was then an Orthodox congregation on Manhattan. Morris Raphael and David Einhorn, as Rabbi Reese pointed out to me before he left, had a different fight over slavery. But here he's attacking Gustavus Poznanski in Charleston. He has come at the behest of the Orthodox contingent in Charleston to defend orthodoxy, and by orthodoxy they very much meant a belief in return to Zion, everything that we hold dear, and that is part of this moment in time of Tisha B'Av. You tell us, in source 5, that these United States are Jerusalem. So this is 9 years later. This is still staying power, this dedication speech in the Courier in 1941. That Israel wishes for no restoration and has none to expect. And so, because a handful of Jews have in these states recovered those inalienable rights, right, who have adopted America as Jefferson as a religion, which belong to them as men, because here are a few, not 1 in 100, of the professors of the faith of Israel throughout the world are relieved from the grievous pressures from without, against which their brethren in the faith have everywhere to bear up, because here, the lowest, the most material of their animal wants can be provided for with abundance, and the finger of scorn is not actually and pointedly held up by the Jew. Therefore, he is to sever his hopes and interests from his suffering brethren. So here is not about the past, but apparently the idea that we are Kol Yisrael are zealous, that we should connect. Not everybody has it as good as Jews in the United States. And it is not only to rob them from that energy, that mortal motive which so long has sustained them, but is even to outrage their feelings and lacerate their hearts by telling them that their constancy is folly, their firm adherence to principles, stiff-neckedness, their deeply rooted faith, a delusion. All is one sentence. But it's not just the reform movement that has tried to do away with the spirit of Tisha B'Av and the notion of Beit HaMikdash and restoration, but it's also some of the Orthodox as well. Take a look at source 6. An article written, LD goes backwards for Dr. Lilienthal. I thought his first name was Doctor. But it's well known that it was him. Writing in 1854, there is a good second part. This is a dissertation of his outline sociologically of the different types of Jews in New York. There's a second group of Jews, that is, that has already come more in contact with the world, and that with sagacious foresight understands very well that something must be done to satisfy the wants of the time. It is the party of external order and decorum, here in the bold section, they are willing to add something to the services and religious ceremonies, a little bit of change, but will never agree that anything should be subtracted therefrom. And here's the important point. As his other example of what defines these traditional Jews who are willing to make certain concessions, they do not wear their beard anymore in the 9 days of Av. So already Tisha B'Av in the 1850s is a symbol of concession. Only the most fervently traditional Orthodox Jews, according to Lilienthal, by mid-19th century, are totally observant the way that they might have been in Europe. And even that middle group, how does Lilienthal choose to define them? Specifically with their observance of the 3 weeks in Tisha B'Av, which is really interesting. It is a signal. It is how Tisha B'Av has become how Jews map themselves onto their communal religious observance. Only a minority at this point are doing Tisha B'Av, and very much tethered to the way that Harvey and others had grappled with their own Americanization and tried to do away with Tisha B'Av. That philosophy bears out on actual religious observance. But it really didn't come to the fore until David Einhorn writes a very important essay, originally in German. I translated, this is my translation from English, into English. He's writing from Baltimore in the 1850s. Many ask, why do we, who do not care to return to Palestine, observe the Churban Beit HaMikdash? This is asked only by those who see nothing in Reform Judaism but a matter of convenience. Many of them chant keynotes without fasting, drape the synagogue in black, but don't shed a tear. For us, however, next to Sinai, I apologize for bringing this to your awareness on this day. This day marks the most important occurrence in our history. The rabbis and the prophetic spirit said, thus today we celebrate the birthday of the Messiah tradition from the last parak of Sanhedrin, namely Israel, in the beginning of its messianic activities. On Passover, we celebrate the redemption from Egypt, our having been chosen as God's firstborn, but today we celebrate the birth of Israel as a redeemer of mankind, for on this day began our wanderings throughout the world. So that's the Apikoursis of Tisha B'Av, that I assume that we all subscribe to, which is Tisha B'Av is no longer a sad day. Churban Abayit, Rachmana litzlan, was a happy occasion. It dispersed us. It allowed us to be Or LaGoyim, to go from nation to nation, community to community. It was an opportunity to dispatch the Jewish people, to give ethical monotheism to the world. And so, says one of the 2 greatest leaders of American reform at that time, along with Isaac Mayer Wise, Tisha B'Av is a day of celebration, a time to celebrate our opportunity. It's not a time to mourn. The Beit HaMikdash, forgive me, is keeping us down. People push back. If we flip to the next page. People push back, and so you have an unidentified author in an Orthodox newspaper, the Jewish Messenger in New York, only leaving his name as a Jew, who was very upset that Bertolt Gotthelf of Vicksburg, Mississippi, offered something very similar to what Einhorn had suggested about 10 years prior. It was in the bolded section in source 8. The Av night, the Tisha B'Av, should be kept no more as a day of lamentations, but a day of rejoicing. For the destruction of Jerusalem has done considerable good by giving freedom of conscience, thus arguing, it's a very American idea, freedom of conscience, thus arguing that we must rejoice at having offended God, for the destruction of Jerusalem was in God's anger. So he said, I've had enough, writes this a Jew, in the pages of the Orthodox Jewish Messenger, but in the pages of the Reform newspaper, the American Israelite, in source 9. Somebody also keeps his name secret, uses the nom de plume observer, says, who is this fellow? And doesn't he know, in the last section, the second to last line, I would furthermore inform him, referring to the author of source 8, that Dr. Godhelf's view on reform are not shared, as this Orthodox Jew has asserted, by only a few so-called fanatics, but by the whole congregation over whom he was appointed to preside. This is now the fate of the reform-dominated American Jewish community. So how does this all change? So I printed out some the Jewish Record. Next page. Take a look at 3 editorials. Because Tisha B'Av, thankfully, does make a comeback. It does make a comeback. And in the Jewish Record, an important newspaper in the 1880s, after a wave of migration, so not the day for us to do math, I understand, but in 1850, when all this was being written, there were about 150,000 Jews living in the United States. By 1880, there were 250,000, still not a very large community. By 1900, there were 1 million. By 1925, there were between 3 and 4 million. We don't always, historians always, they're not very good at math, they don't count all the same. There is a wave of migration beginning in 1881. Tsar Alexander II is murdered, Jews are blamed for it. Jews are actually very much in favor of Tsar Alexander II. That and serious economic lack of opportunities from Europe compelled a wave of the great migration, not just of Jews, but of many different people from Europe. But again, that Jewish community grows in the United States from 250,000 in 1880 to 1 million. The critical mass has been achieved only by the turn of the century. And so much of these changes are happening in that time, in which in Eastern Europe you have a number of, many of those are traditional Jews. Take a look in the editorial in the second column, the Fast of Av. A grievous error, I'm in the third to last paragraph of that column, of some modern Israelites is that of considering the dismemberment of our nationality a supreme benefit to gentilism and of social advantage to our co-religionists. Those philosophizers quote, as they are wont, Talmudical authority to support their theory, but without denying that our dispersion was, in a measure, the means of dissemination of biblical truth, it is certain that it brought on suffering unequal in the annals of mankind, sufferings which have weighed us down to this day. If Jews enjoyed comparative ease on one spot of the globe, on another they were tyrannized ever ruthlessly. And so the migration of the last 2 decades of the 19th century has reminded American Jews, particularly those who were the ones migrating in the first place, was that American Jews don't operate in a silo. And even Jews who would like to adopt Jefferson as a tenet of their faith, and even if we admit that there is something about American exceptionalism, thank God this is a Medina Shel Chesed. I say that as myself, it is a Medina Shel Chesed. But it's complicated. But that migration was a reminder that the Jewish community goes far beyond the Atlantic, that island between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And so what's happening is this globalization, this awareness of in the American Jewish mind, that even though things are pretty good here, let's remember we have a membership into a much larger community that isn't doing so well at present moment. Ask the Jews of Romania how easy it is for them in the 1890s to acquire a passport. It's nearly impossible to do that. Look at the Jews who are struggling to build up the yeshuv. It's very hard to do that under Ottoman rule. Look at Jews, for that matter, don't leave the hemisphere. Look at Jews in South America and Mexico. It's very, very hard to, the Pagan Inquisition is still very much in the culture and the politics of those regions. And so it's a reminder. It's a change that is being had, that's being moved along by a certain globalized awareness at that moment. We turn to the next page, another editorial by Louis Nathan Demnitz. He had a very famous nephew. Anybody know? Brandeis. You got a degree from Brandeis, you have to mention Brandeis another time. So he actually prefigures Brandeis' view of Zionism. Louis Depnick's writing in the American Hebrew, which is a brand new newspaper, started only 10 years earlier, that was founded by kids. That's the other thing. It's not just change of world context, but it's also youth. Youth was part of the change regime in Charleston, South Carolina, and it's once again the change, a theme that my teacher, John Sarna, pushes very much, and I think he's right. Can you hear? That young people augur change. There's something about youth and opportunity, and maybe a certain level of irreverence that forces us to rethink, to make new meaning out of our lives and out of our work. And so Dembitz, writing in a kids newspaper, by the 1890s they were in their 20s, in the American Hebrew. In 1870, the writer of these lines, referring to himself, unfortunately I was never able to find that first editorial in 1870, so we'll just have to base it on his own recollections. In 1870, the writer of these lines was called upon by the editor of a secular newspaper to give, on the eve of the Great Fast, Tisha B'Av, an account of its origins and meaning to his Gentile readers. So it's ironic. Jews didn't care too much by the 1870s about Tisha B'Av, but Gentiles did. And if you take a look in the last paragraph in that column, since 1870, many things in the position of the Jew have changed. A wave of persecution, then quite unexpected, has rolled over Russia and has driven more than 300,000 of its Jews, nearly all of them very poor, to the hospitable shores of America. The anti-Semitic movement, anti-Semitism, is only a new term. It was invented in the 1860s, only popularized in the 1870s and 1880s. The anti-Semitic movement in Germany and in Austria is embittering the lives of our brethren in those countries, though leaving almost untouched their means of subsistence and their civil rights. Its reflex has appeared in this country in the exclusion of the Jew from the haunts of elegant society. Even Jews have been excluded from country clubs, Judge Hilton and the like, in the effort to stamp the men and women of the chosen race as scrubs and vulgarian, unfit ever to become gentlemen or ladies, and what is worse, in combinations of underwriters and in refusals of craft. So let's not forget, says Dembitz, that he's one of the founders of the Orthodox Union, a very important person, and that he's writing from Louisville, Kentucky, part of the South, is also quite important, that in terms of the upper echelons of American life, Jews hadn't yet made it. Yes, Jews have migrated into middle class, but we still have a way to go. But first and foremost is his concern that remember, Judaism isn't just an American construct. There are Jews everywhere. And then finally, the other editorial I reproduced for you, can page again, the memorable night. It continues. This is an editorial. We can imagine the depth and anguish with which the fast allowed. And so it's by 1898, getting to the end of the 19th century, there's a greater awareness and there's a greater impulse to accept and to do Tisha B'Av. Was celebrated in the early years immediately following the loss of the beloved home, Frank Yerushalayim. Today, the symbols of mourning and the bare feet, the dim light, the fast of the dirge, the pious endeavor to foster a momentary sorrow as a duty of loyalty. Continuing down, from Zakai, which is appropriate, but take a look at the next column today. The Jews must read of this loss of temple and nationality not to realize it, but even to know it. It is ancient history almost shadowing into a tradition. And yet, we annually recount the story of being lost and would needs enter its sorrow as earnestly as other people preserve the record of their triumphs and conquests. Why? Going down to the next paragraph, each year our position in this world and our relation to its changes. There's something of, again, that reopening of awareness. It changes somewhat to that extent, modifies our philosophy of loss of Judea. Zionism. So it's not just sorrow, but it's the opportunity for the first time to return to the Holy Land. Zionism is a modern expedient to meet a modern evil, and it has brought many to pray toward the east again, in spirit, if not in fact. This idea that we are not praying to Washington, D.C., we are praying to Jerusalem, was birthed this 1898. So this is only 4 years after the Dreyfus Affair. This is a year after the First World Zionist Congress. This is only 2 years since Theodor Herzl has name recognition throughout the global Jewish community. And so things are changing. And then finally, the last editorial that I'll review with you, self-respect wanting, Henry Moraeus. His father, Sabbatai Moraeus, was a very important Orthodox leader. He himself was a lawyer and a journalist to the American Hebrew. This is all happening in this young people's newspaper, to me, is quite important. It has often been claimed that if Jews would command or attain the respect of the outside world, they must hold very dear their self-respect. When the prospectus of the present season of the Jewish Summer Assembly of Atlantic City was circulated, a reform-sponsored academy, the pamphlet contained an order of opening exercises set down on Sunday, July 16th. What's July 16th? That date corresponding this year with the Black Fast of the 9th of Av. Naturally, was a most unfortunate selection. I, as a Jew, and as a Jewish minister, wrote to the Chancellor of the Jewish Chanus, calling for his attention to the fact that the society bears a distinctly Jewish name, and it therefore validly appeals to all Jews, whether Orthodox or unorthodox. And moreover, it's worth reading this whole thing, as the statement was made that the program is subject to change, I respectfully suggested that the order of exercises set down for the dates mentioned be omitted or transferred to another day. I received a reply from the Reverend gentleman wherein he thanked me for calling his attention to the fact of its being the 9th of Av. He saw no impropriety in holding the opening exercise on that day, but wrote that he would have the appropriate service read for the day, and that there will be no festivities of any kind. I answered expressing appreciation of his sentiments, but putting the question contained in the first sentence of this communication, I further asked whether our Christian neighbors would act likewise on their day of mourning, say, for instance, on Good Friday, and urged again respectfully, in deference to the observance of thousands of Jews, the arrangements for the day and evening mentioned be set aside to the next day or to another day. To the second letter of mine, dated July 4th, Sunday, I received no reply. And in glancing at the latest program, sent out July 14th, I find the request has not been heeded in the slightest. So Tisha B'Av all of a sudden is being come back for a number of reasons. Number one is a certain awareness that while it's good to be a Jew in America, perhaps, first of all, not in the highest rungs of society, but also that's just America. And as migrants are coming from Eastern Europe and other parts of the globe to the United States, there's a greater awareness of their plight, and where Tisha B'Av has resonance. The idea of suffering has resonance. And as we'll see in a moment, Zionism plays a pivotal role too, and the fact that it's young people who are willing to make the change is also critically important. So if we go back to my list of sources on page 2, sorry to make it flip back and forth. Source 10. The 9th of Av. Let us now cast a glance into a strict Orthodox community, this is by a non-Jewish newspaper, the New Era, to study the ritual observed on the 9th of Av. On the eve of the fast day, the people in stockings or slippers are seated on the floor of the synagogue, or rather, on little benches, it's a long tradition of little benches, than their regular seats. Business is not in general interrupted in the ghetto during that day, but in the houses of the pious, The candles of the dead are burning, the children do not play in the streets as usual, the people do not greet one another. After the evening service, at which a lesson of Torah is read, for an Eicha, the fast, excuse me, not it, that's the next, is ended, yeah. Is ended. And so it's also interesting that non-Jews are looking at what is authentically Jewish, and they're looking for Tisha B'Av. And the fact that Jews in the beginning of the 20th century are, because of that pluralism, because of that openness in American life, non-Jews are wondering, well, what is this Judaism thing all about? And there are these historical artifacts of non-Jews becoming very keen on investigating what is this Tisha B'Av thing. Source 12, the 9th of Tisha B'Av comes this year at a time when the hopes of the glorious past of the Holy Land will be revived, still persist in millions of Jewish hearts. The time has not yet come when Orthodox Jews are unwilling to observe the day by fasting and prayer. Whether it ever will come is extremely doubtful. So that continues. Sher Tachlita has successfully rehabilitated Tisha B'Av. Now that working for Zionism has come to supplement the ancient and time-honored custom of prayer for it, we may reasonably hope that the custom of mourning for Zion will, ere many years have rolled around, be regarded as no longer necessary. So the historical actors themselves are recognizing that here's an opportunity to think long and hard, not just about Jewish suffering, the whole world over, not historically how we have lost two Batei Mikdash, but also an opportunity to think long and hard about what are we going to do about the Zionist project. This is not a time in which we have a Yom HaAtzmaut. This isn't a Jewish state question quite yet. This is an opportunity to think about, well, what are we going to make of a Jewish homeland? And that project wasn't about a Yom Tov yet, not a Chag, Yom Chag HaAtzmaut. It wasn't about Yom Yerushalayim quite yet. That was still decades away, a half a century away, truly. Right now, there's an opportunity to think long and hard about what are we going to do about it. And so Tisha B'Av became that moment to think about it and to write about it. But finally, returning to young people, it also has much to do with camp. Camp is really important. I'm thinking about camp. I'm not going to be at Skokie Shiloh for much longer, but during July, it's always very pleasant for me to observe Yeshiva HaKaitz. I never attended Yeshiva HaKaitz. I always attended Camp Moshe Even before we moved to Chicago. I attended Wild Rose. And even as a counselor at a different Moshe, there's something about Tisha B'Av in a camp setting, and this is not an infomercial for Camp Moshe. I'm led to believe that at Morash and at Camp Levi and at Camp of Good, Camp Benos, equal opportunity meaningfulness here. There's something very special for different generations of Jewish campers, at Sleepaway Camp in particular, in which Tisha B'Av gained, in a certain way, unpronounced meaning. It was a time in which we were away from our usual settings, which campfires looked a little different, where not eating meant a little different, where the Chader Ochal was transformed into something that it wasn't, where there wasn't any bug juice, in which our counselors weren't just people who played basketball a little bit better than we did, but they were our teachers. And they held these torches, and there was this ceremony, and it couldn't help but make meaning out of Tisha B'Av and a Jewish camp experience. And I'm convinced, I can't prove it, but I'm convinced that Tisha B'Av's comeback had something very, notwithstanding all the other elements of the late 19th century, but Jewish camping, perhaps more than anything else, is responsible for the great Tisha B'Av comeback in American Jewish life. Take a look at a couple of sources and see what I mean. And they don't do justice to at least my memory of Tisha B'Av in camp. Source 13. The observance of the Eve of Tisha B'Av was indeed beautiful and traditional. This is in camp, I guess, Malach. is how they pronounce it. Seated on the floor, it's one of the early Orthodox Jewish camps. Campers and counselors were called the periodic exiles, which began with the first and second destruction of the temple. Uncle Hal Kaufman, in his characteristic way, held his audience spellbound by his dramatic narration of the history of Tisha B'Av. In fact, in the American Hebrew, that same newspaper I was reading from, they would produce stories of Tisha B'Av, so camp counselors and Hebrew school teachers and principals and superintendents and pulpit rabbis had the narration down, but they told it in a certain way, which could make the most meaning and impart to young people. So then, Uncle Bernie interpreted the history of Tisha B'Av, past and present. They intuited, it's not just about the past, but let's make it a moment. Let's bring it to the contemporary present. He pointed out the significance of dispersion of our people in what is the modern condition of the Jew, not the dispersion as being a means to propagate ethical monotheism, but how the dispersion somehow is emblematic of Tisha B'Av in 2,000 years prior. And as a fitting climax to the evening, Cantor Cantor chanted the keynotes. Whether or not these names are reflective of our personal memory, it's quite appropriate that the cantor should be named Cantor. A word of praise is an order for the Hebrew group, which was led by our very able Hirsch Stein. So, substitute those names for the names I suspect many of you went to camp. Substitute those names for your memories. If you can't remember those names of the people from your childhood, imagine what they look like. Or imagine what your children did. Your nephews, your nieces, your grandchildren. It was a moment. It was something to behold. And for me, I don't remember all that much about Moshe Rabbeinu. But I remember in great detail what psychologists call a flashbulb memory. Is that, when speaking of flashbulb, I've been doing a little bit of reading into flashbulb memory. It's those memories that usually take place between when we're 12 to 25. It's if people, I wasn't around then, but it's the way people remember 1963, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It's people who much later remember 9/11 differently. It's quite strange, right? It's that some of you were adults. Some of you were principals of when I was in 11th grade at that moment. And maybe I remember it differently. Maybe because at 9/11, because I was situated at a certain age bracket, it has a more pivotal memory. Think about the assassination of Martin Luther King, and not just sad moments. Think about happy moments. Think about 1967. Think, and I don't mean to condescend, but think about where you were when what's his name? I'm not a Cubs fan. Who's the third baseman? What?
Which what's his name?
The third baseman who grounded the field ball through to the first base of the Cubs, won the World Series.
Yeah. Oh, Brian.
Thank you. Former Rookie of the Year and MVP. I'm having a moment. Yes. Think about where you were, and those create flashbulb memories. As silly as they sometimes are, but as important as they usually are, that's what a generation saw in Tisha B'Av. That had happened in their youth was critically important to refurbishing the day on behalf of the Jewish people. And a more important, more well-known camp is Camp Masad in source 14. I'm not going to read the entire source for you. But Maurice Shavatsky, who's the founder of the camp, refers in 4 lines down to the how Tisha B'Av affected the meaningfulness of camp in that moment. And of course, and I'll close with this, the last reason for Tisha B'Av to make its full-fledged comeback in the life cycle, in the yearly cycle of American Jewish life has very much to do with the Shoah. A lot can be read aloud about the Holocaust, about the Shoah. Normally, I might read from Kolu Lidovek, from the words of Rabbi Soloveitchik, but also given the fact that we lost him only a little bit over a year ago, I'll read from Rabbi Norman Lamb. in a not together well-known essay he wrote in 1956. Here he was just Norman then, I don't think he was rabbi then. Practically, the continued observance of Tisha B'Av, writing with the Orthodox Union magazine Jewish Life in 1956, the continued observance of Tisha B'Av must concern itself with the two great historical events of modern times, as well as with past history. These two are Chorban Europa and the founding of Medinat Israel. A valid Orthodox view on the question of continued observance of national fast days based on halachic grounds sees no need of discarding them because of contemporary developments. It sees rather in the great historic events of the last 2 decades an opportunity for deepening our experience of these days, an occasion for discovering new avenues of expression of the entire gamut of our national experiences within rather than without the framework of the hallowed traditions of Israel. By blending these historic events into the grand stream of Jewish religious life, we will find an opportunity for giving new dimensions to our near-emasculated religious consciousness. So rather than writing in the 1950s, in which many pundits at that moment, Nathan Glazer, Marshall Square, were predicting the demise of Orthodoxy, what Rabbi Lamb was suggesting wasn't really altogether new. The blending together of the hope of Zion, of religious Zionism, or political, whatever, revisionist, doesn't matter. Zionism, together with tragedy, and the broadening of American awareness beyond these shores, but to return, to reconnect those conduits to a broader Jewish peoplehood, all in effect gave new meaning to Tisha B'Av. And what's incredible about our Jewish tradition, when I say new meaning, I mean nothing heretical. I mean that we as a people, take a look at the keynote, and how we have buried tragedy after tragedy, crusades, the Shoah, the first Beit HaMikdash, the Inquisition, from Spain and Portugal, and we somehow bend it into Tisha B'Av. This is our legacy. This is how we make meaning of our calendar, and perhaps no other moment in the year is so laser focused on this concept than it is of Tisha B'Av. The history of Tisha B'Av and its draining and then renewed making teach us about how we make ourselves, how we put ourselves into Tisha B'Av, and ultimately how we connect to all of these texts, how we make meaning of sometimes, and for some people, a day that it was near impossible to connect to. But how our strategy has always been to take the past and present so that next year, the future of Tisha B'Av, perhaps more than any other time, looks altogether different than here at the end.